Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. The king who couldn't see her, 7 years of silence turned a royal hall into a tomb of echoes. Then a maid's daughter stepped into forbidden space, like fear had never been invented. She spoke to the blind vampire king, as if loneliness was the real curse. And the moment the guards moved to strike, the king raised one hand and stopped death itself. The castle of Wellenford did not feel alive anymore. It functioned, it obeyed, it endured, but it did not breathe. Inside its black stone corridors, servants learned to walk softly, not because they were polite, but because sound could become a crime. In the heart of that fortress sat King Valerian Drovblind, feared and untouched by warmth for years. His blindness was not the kind that made people sympathetic. It made them cautious, because the king's hearing was sharper than any sight, and his temper was sharper than steel. Every evening, the same ritual repeated. The long banquet table, 16 empty chairs, a single place setting, and a meal the king barely tasted. He ate because kings must appear unbreakable, even when their hearts are already buried. The ticking of the old clock measured his solitude like a sentence. Nobody dared join him. Nobody dared speak unless commanded. The servants whispered that a king who could not see had learned to sense lies the way wolves sense blood, and that his grief had turned into something colder than cruelty, something absolute. Down in the servant quarters, Lena worked until her hands stung with soap and water, scrubbing the floors that would never shine enough to matter. She had come to the castle years ago, after the war took her husband and left her with a child and a broken home. Her daughter, Era, was everything the castle could never understand, small, curious, and dangerously kind. Era did not know what power meant. She only knew what she saw in people's voices: fear, sadness, anger, hunger. That evening, Lena was sent to clean a corridor near the royal dining wing, the place where servants were told not to look, not to linger, and definitely not to enter. Lena worked fast, eyes down, praying her daughter would remain in the kitchen where she had left her sorting herbs with the cooks. But children do not obey prayers, and kindness does not follow rules. Era heard the silence in the air like it was calling her name. While Lena rinsed a bucket and turned her head for only a moment, the little girl slipped away, bare feet quiet on stone, moving like a question nobody wanted asked. She followed the scent of candles and warm food and old sadness until she reached the tall doors that were never meant to open for someone like her. Era pushed, and the door gave way as if even the castle was tired of being closed. Inside, she saw a hall too large for one person and too empty for a king. At the far end sat a man dressed in black and silver, his face turned toward nothing, a dark blindfold over his eyes like a wound he chose to wear. He did not look up, but the moment Era stepped in, his fork paused mid-her. He had heard her. He had smelled her. Human. Child. Uninvited. "Stop," the king said, his voice sharp enough to cut stone. Era stopped, then took another step anyway, because fear did not live in her the way it lived in adults. She walked to the table, climbed onto a chair with effort, and sat as if she belonged there. The sound of a small body settling beside him broke 7 years of ritual. "You're eating all alone," she said, not as an insult, but as a fact that made her sad. "That's not nice. Nobody should eat alone." The air changed instantly. Guards rushed in, boots thundered, and Lena's terrified voice followed, begging for forgiveness before punishment even arrived. "Your Majesty, she didn't mean please. She's only a child." Era looked from the king's still face to the shaking adults, and frowned as if they were the ones behaving strangely. The guards raised their weapons, ready to drag her away, ready to erase the mistake of her existence. But the king lifted one pale hand, and the entire room froze like a spell had been cast. In the silence that followed, the blind vampire king turned his head toward the girl and asked, quietly, as if the question mattered more than the laws of his castle, "What is your name?" Era's voice brightened. "Era, what's yours?" The king's lips parted slightly, like he had forgotten what it felt like to answer something honestly. "Valerian," he said. Era leaned closer, studying him with the seriousness of a child who believed she could fix broken things. "That's a heavy name," she decided. "Can I call you Val?" The guards looked ready to faint. Lena looked ready to collapse. But the king did not rage. Instead, something almost invisible shifted in his breathing. Like a locked door in his chest had moved a fraction, and then Era reached toward him, slow and gentle, and placed her warm little hand on his cold cheek. Valerian went perfectly still, as if touch itself was more dangerous than any blade. For one heartbeat, nobody moved, nobody breathed, and the entire kingdom balanced on the edge of what the king would do next. Then, in a voice so low it sounded like a secret, he said, "Bring her a chair, and bring her something sweet." Lena stared, unable to understand. The blind king had not ordered punishment. He had ordered welcome not, but across the hall, hidden behind a column of shadow, an unseen servant watched the impossible scene with wide eyes and quietly slipped away to report it to the one person who would never allow the king to heal. That night, the king's sister would learn a maid's daughter had touched the royal face, and she would decide the child must be removed before she became the king's weakness. The girl under his shadow, the castle learned her name before it learned to accept her. Some saw a miracle. Others saw a mistake that should be erased. The king began waiting for footsteps he pretended not to need. And in the dark corners of the palace, something cruel started to plan. After that night, the castle of Wellenford did not return to its old silence. It tried to, but silence, once broken by a child's voice, never comes back the same way. Era was not announced, not invited, and not officially permitted to sit at the royal table. Yet every evening, when the candles were lit and the long shadows returned, Magnus the steward would arrive at the servant quarters with a message that sounded more like a request than an order. The king wished for the girl's company during dinner. Lena never knew whether to feel honored or terrified. She washed Era's face, fixed her simple dress, and walked beside her through halls where servants still stopped and stared, some with disbelief, some with resentment, some with fear. The guards no longer raised their weapons, but their eyes followed the child as if she were a spark walking through dry grass. Valerian never said he was waiting, but he always knew the exact moment Era entered the hall. His head would turn toward the sound of her steps, his posture shifting in a way so subtle only Magnus noticed it. At first, their dinners were quiet. Era talked because that was her nature, and the king listened because listening was easier than remembering how to speak. She told him about spilled soup in the kitchens, about a cat that stole fish, about how the sky looked like melted gold at sunset, even though he could not see it. In return, Valerian told her about stars he remembered from before the war, mapping constellations in the air with his finger, as if the darkness might obey him. The servants watched from a distance, unsure whether they were witnessing a fragile miracle or the beginning of something dangerous. Not everyone was willing to pretend. This was harmless. Some maids whispered that the girl was using witchcraft. Some guards muttered that the king had grown weak. Others, who had lost family in the war and still feared the throne, looked at Era like she was a knife placed too close to a sleeping giant. Lena felt those looks like cold rain on her back. She kept her daughter close, reminded her to be polite, to be quiet, to never touch anything without permission. Era tried, but kindness is clumsy, and curiosity does not understand politics. One afternoon, a cook slapped Era's hand away from a tray of bread and called her servant's dirt. Lena arrived just in time to see her daughter's lip tremble, and something inside her broke with quiet rage. That evening, Ira said nothing about it at first. She sat beside Valerian, swinging her legs, and listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then, as simply as one might mention the weather, she said, "Some people here are very mean." Valerian's fingers tightened slightly around his goblet. "Did someone hurt you?" he asked, his voice calm in the way storms are calm before they arrive. Ares shrugged. "Not really. They just don't like me." The hall felt colder. Valerian did not raise his voice. He did not summon guards. He only said one sentence, spoken to the air itself. "In this castle, anyone who harms what is under my protection harms me." The next day, the cook who had struck Era was reassigned far from the inner halls, and no one ever spoke of it openly. But everyone understood. Protection, however, has a price. The more the king showed favor, the more eyes turned toward the girl, measuring her, weighing her, wondering how long such a fragile thing could remain close to so much power. Rumors began to crawl through the court like insects. Some said the child was cursed. Some said she was a tool. Some said she would be used against the king. And far above them all, in a tower that never welcomed light, Valerian's sister listened to these whispers with interest and a cold, patient smile. Seraphine did not rush. She never did. She asked for reports. She asked for names. She asked for details about the maid and her daughter and the blind king who was no longer quite as empty as he used to be. When she finally stood before her mirror and watched the image of her brother sitting with a human child, her expression did not change, but her decision was already made. Weakness, she believed, must be removed before it teaches the kingdom to bleed. That night, as Lena tucked Ara into bed, unaware of the storm gathering, a sealed message crossed the palace in secret, carrying one simple order. The maid's daughter was to be tested, and if she failed, she would be sent away forever. By morning, Ara would be accused of something she did not do, and the entire court would be forced to choose whether she was a guest or a mistake. The king's darkness was not only in his eyes, but in his past. The girl was never meant to touch the secret he hid from the world. One moment of kindness would awaken something everyone thought was dead, and one careless accusation would push the castle toward disaster. The morning began with whispers, the kind that moved faster than footsteps and cut deeper than knives. Lena felt them before she heard them, in the way servants stopped talking when she passed, in the way eyes followed Era with a new, sharper curiosity. By the time the bells marked noon, the rumor had grown into something with teeth. A silver goblet from the treasury room had gone missing, and someone had seen the maid's daughter near the corridor that led there. It did not matter that the corridor also led to 3 kitchens, 2 storage rooms, and a guard post. Stories do not need truth when they have fear. Era did not understand why people were suddenly unkind again, why a guard took her gently but firmly by the shoulder and told her she had to answer some questions. Lena's heart began to pound so hard she could barely breathe. They brought the girl to a small chamber near the court offices, where officials with clean hands and colder eyes asked questions in soft voices that felt like traps. Era answered honestly, because lying had never occurred to her. She said she had been chasing a cat. She said she liked the echo in that hallway. She said she did not even know what a treasury was. The men exchanged looks that pretended to be thoughtful. One of them wrote something down. Outside, Lena waited, hands shaking, already imagining exile, already imagining the road back to nothing, when Valerian heard that the girl had been taken from the servant's wing without his knowledge. Something old and dangerous stirred in him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop as he rose from his chair and said, bring her to me." They tried to explain. He did not listen. By the time Era was brought into the dining hall, escorted by 2 nervous guards, the entire castle felt like it was holding its breath. She ran to him as soon as she was released, wrapping her small hands around his sleeve. "I didn't take anything, Val," she said quickly, as if the truth itself might trip and fall if she did not hold it steady. "I know," he said, and he did not say it as a guess. He dismissed everyone with a single gesture. When the doors closed, the hall felt too big again, but different now, like a place where secrets were about to be spoken. Valerian sat and listened to her breathing, to the small nervous movements she made when she was worried. Then he told her something he had never told anyone outside a very small circle. He told her about the Sunfall War, about the battlefield that burned like a second sun, about the magic that tore through the sky and left him alive but blind. He told her his blindness was not only injury, but a curse woven into the last spell of that war, a punishment meant to follow him as long as he lived. "I cannot see," he said quietly, "but I can feel when something is true." Era was silent for a moment, then said, "That's very unfair." The words were simple, but they landed like a verdict. Without asking, she reached up and touched the edge of his blindfold. Valerian stiffened. Nobody touched that. Nobody ever. "Era," he warned, not angry, but afraid. "It hurts." "I won't pull," she promised. "I just want to see what you always hide." Her fingers brushed the fabric, and in that instant, something happened that should not have been possible. Behind the darkness of his eyes, a brief flash of light bloomed, not shapes, not colors, just the memory of brightness, like sunlight through closed lids. Valerian's breath caught. He pulled his head back, heart pounding, the world suddenly too loud. He said nothing, but he could not forget what he had felt. Hope is a dangerous thing, especially to someone who has lived without it for years. That evening, as the officials quietly discovered the goblet had been misplaced by one of their own, Seraphine received the report she had been waiting for. The accusation had failed, but something far more interesting had happened. The girl had touched the king's curse and lived. Seraphine smiled. If the girl could effect the curse, then she was no longer just a child, she was a threat. And Seraphine would not allow threats to remain. Asterisk, she returned with a smile that hid sharper intentions than any blade. The court listened to her like one listens to a coming storm. The girl became a problem that politics could finally justify. And the king was forced to defend something he never planned to love. Seraphine's arrival was announced with bells and careful words, but the castle felt the change long before she crossed the main gate. Servants began to move faster, guards stood straighter, and even the air in the corridors seemed to grow more cautious. Valerian did not need sight to know when his sister entered his world again. He recognized her presence by the way people's voices tightened around her, by the way confidence tried to hide itself behind politeness. When she entered the throne room, her voice carried warmth, but warmth that had learned to imitate kindness rather than feel it. "Brother," she said, as if the word itself was a gift. Valerian inclined his head, offering courtesy and nothing more. Seraphine wasted no time. Over the next days, she spoke with council members, with nobles who had grown restless during the king's long isolation, with merchants who feared instability more than injustice. She did not argue openly against Valerian. She did something far more effective. She asked questions. Why was a human child allowed such access? Why was a servant's family being favored? What did it say about the strength of the crown? Each question sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a net. The court began to murmur again, this time with permission. Some said the king was being manipulated. Some said the girl was a distraction. Some said the realm could not afford a ruler whose heart was soft. Lena felt the change immediately. Doors that had once been merely cold became hostile. Era was no longer ignored. She was watched. Even Magnus, loyal as stone, began to walk closer behind her in the halls. Seraphine chose her moment carefully. She requested a private audience with her brother and spoke not as a rival, but as family. "You are building something fragile," she said, her tone almost gentle. "Neighboring realms are watching us. They will not hesitate if they smell weakness." Valerian's voice remained calm. "Kindness is not weakness." Seraphine smiled. "It is, when it can be taken from you." She spoke of alliances, of heirs, of duties. Then she spoke of the girl, not with hatred, not with anger, but with careful concern. "She is human. She is mortal. She will grow, change, leave, or die. And when she does, what will remain of you?" Valerian said nothing, but his silence was not agreement. That evening, when Era sat beside him and talked about clouds shaped like animals, he listened more closely than ever, as if memorizing something he refused to lose. The next day, Seraphine made her move in public. During a council gathering, she suggested a new rule. No servant or commoner should be allowed in royal spaces without formal purpose. It was framed as security. It was framed as order. It was framed as necessary. Many agreed. Valerian stood, and the room went quiet. "The child is under my protection," he said simply. "Any rule that endangers her endangers my crown." The words were not loud, but they were final. Asterisk that night, Seraphine stood in her tower and listened to the reports. The king had chosen. Not the realm, not the council. The child. Her expression did not change. "Then we stop asking," she said, "and we start removing." Far below, Lena tucked Era into bed and told her a story about a brave bird that lived in a dark forest. Era fell asleep smiling, unaware that her name had already been written into plans that did not care about innocence. Asterisk by the next full moon. Seraphine's trap would be ready, and this time the girl would not walk away so easily. The hunt in the moonlit castle. They did not call it a punishment. They called it procedure. They did not raise weapons. They raised laws. The girl became a problem the court could finally erase. And the king arrived too late to stop what had already begun. The night the trap closed, the castle was dressed in celebration. Banners were raised, musicians filled the outer halls, and visiting nobles were invited for what Seraphine called a unity gathering, a harmless display of strength and order meant to reassure the realm. Valerian felt the tension long before anything happened. Too many footsteps, too many careful voices, too much sweetness in the air. He kept Era close that evening, his hand resting on the back of her chair as if proximity alone could protect her. She was excited by the lights and the music, asking endless questions, while Lena watched from a distance with a fear she could not name, but could not escape. The accusation was delivered in the middle of the gathering, where no one could pretend it was a mistake. A court official stepped forward and announced that an important document seal had been tampered with, and that witnesses had seen a small figure near the records room earlier that day. The room grew very quiet. Era did not even understand the words, only the way all the eyes turned toward her at once. Lena rushed forward, but guards gently blocked her path. "It is only a formality," Seraphine said smoothly. "A simple investigation. If she is innocent, she will return before the night ends." Valerian stood. The music died. "She is innocent," he said. "This ends now." Seraphine's reply was calm, almost regretful. "Brother, even kings must respect process. If you stop this, you tell the realm that your will stands above its laws." The word law hung in the air like a blade. Valerian hesitated, not because he doubted the child, but because he understood the game being played. In that hesitation, The guards took Era by the hand and led her away. They did not take her to a cell. That would have been too honest. They took her to a quiet wing of the castle, one that connected to the old outer corridors, the ones that led toward the forested edge of the grounds. The official story was that she would wait there while the inquiry was conducted. The real plan was simpler. By the time anyone realized she was gone, she would be outside the castle walls, and no one would bother searching for a servant's child in the dark. Lena fought like a mother who had nothing left to lose, but she was held back. Magnus tried to intervene, but orders had already been sealed and carried out. Valerian felt the moment Ira was no longer in the castle, the way one feels a sudden silence after a constant sound disappears. His chest tightened. He turned his head slowly. "Where is she?" he asked. No one answered fast enough. When he understood, when the truth reached him, something inside the blind king finally broke its chains. The shadows in the hall seemed to deepen as he moved, faster and more certain than anyone had seen him in years. He did not call for guards. He did not call for explanations. He followed what he could hear, what he could sense, the faint echo of a small, frightened heartbeat moving farther and farther away. Era was escorted through a side passage and out, into the cold night, told she was going for a walk until her mother came. She tried to be brave, but the trees looked like tall, quiet monsters, and the path was not one she knew. When the guards turned back, leaving her with only a lantern and a direction, she stood very still and tried not to cry. Behind her, far away but moving with terrifying purpose, Valerian stepped into the open air for the first time in years without counting his steps alone in the forest. The girl would soon discover she was not the only one hunting, and the king would learn just how far his enemies were willing to go. The queen no one expected the forest did not care that she was small and afraid. The kingdom did not care that she was innocent. But the blind king cared more than he had ever cared about anything. And before dawn, the fate of the throne would be rewritten. Era walked slowly through the dark trees, holding the lantern with both hands the way her mother had taught her, trying to be brave even though every sound felt too loud and every shadow felt too close. The guards had told her to follow the path and wait, but the path was not kind, and waiting felt like something only lost people did. She tried to remember Valerian's voice, the calm way he always spoke, and told herself that he would come. She did not know how, but she believed it the way children believe in morning after night. Behind her, deeper in the forest, something else moved. Not a monster from stories, not a beast, but men who had been paid well to make sure a child never found her way back. Seraphine's orders had been simple and clean. No blood in the castle. No scandal. Just an unfortunate disappearance that the world would forget. Valerian did not forget Dot. He moved through the night like a storm that had learned where it was going. He did not see the roots, the stones, the low branches, but he did not need to. He listened to the world, and the world answered him. Every snapped twig, every disturbed bird, every frightened breath told him where to go. The curse that had taken his sight had never taken his will. When he heard Era cry out, small and terrified, something inside him finally tore open. The men found her first. They stepped out of the trees with practiced calm and gentle voices that did not match their purpose. Era backed away, heart racing, the lantern shaking in her hands. Then the night itself seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, cold. One of the men turned just in time to realize they were no longer alone. Valerian did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply stood between them and the child, and in that moment, the forest understood who the real danger was. The men ran. They did not get far. By the time they were gone, the night was quiet again, and Era was crying into the front of his dark coat, her small hands gripping him like he might disappear if she let go. He knelt, held her carefully, and for the first time did not pretend he was made of stone. When dawn came, the castle was forced to listen. Seraphine stood before the court and spoke of order and mistakes and unfortunate misunderstandings. Valerian let her speak. Then he told the story as it was, calmly, without anger, without drama. He named the orders. He named the intent. He named the betrayal. The room did not argue with him. Some power does not need to raise its voice. The council turned. The nobles turned. Even those who had feared weakness now saw something else. A king who would walk into darkness for what he protected. Later, in his private chamber, Valerian sat while Hera played quietly on the rug, and Magnus stood nearby like a witness to history. Valerian reached for his blindfold, hesitated, then slowly removed it. He did not expect a miracle. He did not expect the world to return. But when Hera looked up at him and smiled, he saw something, not clearly, not fully, but light. The shape of her, the truth of her. The curse had not been broken by power. It had been weakened by kindness. That day, Valerian made a declaration that silenced every remaining doubt. Hera and her mother were no longer servants at the castle. They were under royal protection, by name and by law. One day, he said quietly, this child will not walk these halls as a guest. She looked at him. Then what will I be? He smiled, and this time, it was not a ghost of a smile. You will be family. And so the blind king, who had ruled in darkness, began to rule in light, and the maid's daughter, who had walked into a forbidden hall without fear, became the heart of a kingdom that learned at last that true power is the courage to protect what is gentle. And that is how a blind king found his future, and a forgotten child became the beginning of a new crown.